So you're starting a new Laravel project, and you know it will be larger than what you're used to. It's a kind of project that takes a team of developers to work on for several months, if not years. And this is the kind of project where you want to think about architecture up front, instead of winging it and see where the standard Laravel CRUD approach takes you. In this series, we'll discuss ways to design such projects. The goal not only being long-term maintainability, but also to allow several developers to work in such a large code base in an efficient way. Many of the principles we'll discuss are taken from existing and well-known paradigms: domain-driven design, hexagonal architecture, and event sourcing. And this series will bring theory and practice together in a Laravel project. In this first episode, we'll focus on structuring code in such ways that developers can easily find their way around the code base, even when they haven't written parts of the code themselves. And while this might seem like a minor detail, it's actually one that can have a very high impact on your day-to-day programmer life, individually and as a team. Let's look at an example. Here's a clean Laravel project, and let's imagine we're building an application to manage hotel bookings. Your project manager or business analyst has sat down with the client and discussed the project in depth. They made a first analysis and identified several models or entities that are crucial to the business: units, bookings, and invoices. And they even made some ERD diagrams to make sure everything is clear. So you can go ahead, write model code migrations, and be on your way. The next step is to add CRUD controllers, forms, and whatnot. So let's stop and think about what we're doing. Let's look at how our code is structured. There's a controller folder, one for models, and you probably also added some jobs and request classes, events, listeners, stuff like that. Essentially, you've split the code based on its technical properties. You've grouped models with models, controllers with controllers, and so on. Now, in small projects, this approach works just fine. However, let's imagine a few hundred models, maybe 500 or 1,000 controllers. If you're building an event-driven system, there's probably hundreds of events and listeners. And these numbers aren't even that exceptional because Laravel is a great framework to write these kinds of projects in. And you can imagine that things grow out of hand rather quickly. And you probably start by making sub-namespaces. So controllers, invoices, controllers, units, events, invoices, events, bookings, and stuff like that. Now imagine a team of 5 developers, each working on their own piece of the project for several months. They're constantly jumping around the codebase, going from one place to another to make changes. On a level of code structure, this is the definition of spaghetti code. Now, this is where domains come in. The word domain, by the way, it means a sphere of activity or knowledge. It's a group, a bubble of code of related things. If we manage to properly identify different domains in our project, we'll be able to create some kind of boundaries within the code. We'll group code together that conceptually belongs together. Now, if we're just doing this for the sake of adding a little clarity within the file structure, it might seem like we're overthinking the problem. However, we can build upon this simple principle of grouping code in domains, and we can do some really useful stuff, all of which we'll thoroughly discuss during this course. So let's bring that into practice. Let's have a root domain namespace, and let's put all domain-related code in there. In our example, there will actually be 3 domains for now: units, bookings, and invoices. Now let's go back to that source directory I made. Why is that? The answer itself is simple, but I need to give some more background information first. In the end, we will not put all invoice-related code, for example, in the invoices domain folder. That might sound contradictory to what I said earlier, but there's actually a good reason. We're going to separate so-called application code from domain code. That means that controllers, request validation classes, route middleware, stuff like that won't end up in the domain. See, the domain code should represent a bubble of code, a group of knowledge that's highly tied together. It's about representing the business logic, the rules with code. Application code, on the other hand, often crosses the boundaries between the bubbles we've created. Think about an admin dashboard displaying statistics read from across several data sources, or another example, a complex onboarding form that will need knowledge about unit occupancy, as well as to be able to create automatic invoices. You should think of application code as the glue between domains, their goal exposing the domain code in a usable way to the end user. And both are very different in the way they're developed. For example, domain code will be easily unit tested, while application code will benefit more from integration tests on a higher level. Now, I promise we will dig deeper into all the differences between them in later episodes. But for now, it does explain why I created the source folder. Besides the domain namespace, we'll use app to store our application code. And personally, I find app/app and app/domain a little confusing, so that's why source has my preference. But no worries though, if you would like to stick with the default Laravel conventions, that's fine too. And now that you know a little bit about domains in general, you might be thinking of microservices, where each piece is a service on its own. However, there's an important difference. We're still working in the same code base, and technically it's possible to communicate directly between domains. In fact, you'll even see me do that once in a while in this series. The reality is that not a single business is a collection of perfectly separated processes. They do depend on each other. So the architecture and patterns we'll look at won't prohibit you from communicating between domains, but there are some things to keep in mind. For example, if you're working in an asynchronous, event-driven system, you probably do want a strict separation between domain groups, and such projects might probably benefit from a full-blown microservice architecture, but that's not the focus of this course. We'll mainly look at projects that are still one majestic monolith, yet built in a decoupled and flexible way. So that leaves us with one question: how to identify domains. And I've given the example of units, bookings, and invoices, but you know from experience that there's always more to the business than 3 simple models. And the reality is that you cannot make strict rules about identifying domains. The boundaries between them will highly depend on the specific context, and that's something you and your client will have to discover together. And this step by itself can take weeks, even months, and it might continue even when you're already started coding. And that's fine, because we can always refactor domains later. If you notice down the road that a specific domain group is too large or too small, you can decide to merge or split them accordingly. Since we're still within the same project, those changes have a very small impact. Now, in the next episodes, we will zoom into the domain folders. We'll discuss patterns that are useful to write this kind of code. We will sometimes diverge from the Laravel way in order to better fit the project's need. And after we got a firm grip on the domain code, we will move to the application layer to actually expose all that functionality to the user.